You don't get paid for shipping security, and that's a problem. In our thirst for developing the newest technologies, our business practices have enabled and opened huge gaps in our product and data security. If it seems like these cyber attacks are increasing, it's because they are. And it's a business problem, not a cybersecurity problem. We keep hearing of new technologies such as AI that are going to further enable cybersecurity, but our experts are skeptical.
The human without the suit is weak. The suit without the human is dumb. AI and machine learning, these different computer learning things that we've got to work with now in cybersecurity and right across the board, they're levers. They're not a replacement, in my mind, for human intelligence. If and when that happens, we're going to be worried about Skynet, not these conversations. And I'm going to be thinking about how to hack that stuff to make sure that humans stay safe.
On this episode of IT Visionaries, we explore the impact AI and technology are having on society and cybersecurity with Casey Ellis, the founder and CTO of Bugcrowd, and Malcolm Harkins, a cybersecurity advisor, coach, and board member. The two discuss why you'll never be able to eliminate risk and why the lack of financial incentives is leaving most companies vulnerable to nefarious attacks. Enjoy this episode.
IT Visionaries is brought to you by the Salesforce platform, the world's most trusted low-code platform. Enhance trust, compliance, and governance across all your apps with Salesforce Security. Learn more at salesforce.com/data security.
Welcome everyone to another episode of IT Visionaries, and today we're continuing our security series with Casey Ellis and Malcolm Harkins. This topic is going to be about the impact of AI and technology on society and cybersecurity. But, I do these gentlemen a disservice by not letting them introduce themselves. Casey, let's start with you. Tell our audience who you are, where do you work, what do you do, and we'll kick it over to Malcolm.
Thanks, Albert. It's great to be on, great to be chatting about this. Good to see you again, Malcolm, as well. Yeah, my name's Casey Ellis, as you called out there, so I don't need to do that part again. From the founder, chairman, and CTO of Bugcrowd. Basically, Bugcrowd, what we did was to introduce the concept of connecting, the white hat community, like this crowd of creative individuals that can answer security questions that have been waiting at the table, I think at this point in time for a number of decades, but have been disconnected from people that need help. We started off that industry back in 2012. So, that's commonly referred to or known as bug bounty programs and vulnerability disclosure programs. In truth, we're finding all sorts of different ways to take advantage of that resource and plug it into the problems that exist. But yeah, that's what I do, and that's why I'm here.
Malcolm, how about you introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks. And great to be on with both you, Albert and Casey. So currently I'm a board member, advisor, coach, mentor, dabble with a lot of security startups and a few others in the industry. Prior to that, I was chief security and trust officer with a web application security defense platform company for a little over a year. Prior to that, I was chief security and trust officer with Silence. And then prior to that, I spent my life at Intel, and I was chief security and privacy officer at Intel, so spanned a wide range of fun and eclectic activities.
So, Malcolm, you have a big swath of history in cybersecurity or cyber and security space. Casey, you're building, how would you describe it? Are you building like a marketplace almost of people that are good at, because it's like I come to you to access the best talent for short-term projects? How should we best think of Bugcrowd?
In a sense, it's talent, but it's also just answers to questions. Like, we're talking about AI and its role, computing and the way that we extract creativity from computer solutions that we've built has improved and continues to improve, but there's still this element of necessity behind access to human creativity. So really what, Bugcrowd does, it's almost like a knowledge platform. Like, people have security questions that require a creative answer. We've got access to all of the different places that answer could exist. Our job is to put the question in the right place. So that's summing it up, I think, on a kind of conceptual level. Like, practically what that looks like is vulnerability discovery in systems. That's a lot of what we do. Ranging from web applications right through to critical infrastructure. We've done work with the Department of Defense and systems that belong to the Air Force. It's this very broad smattering of different technologies where we apply humans to come in and basically help people understand what risks they need to mitigate next. Because at this point in time, I feel like security is dinner table conversation. Like, I think it's consensus that we need to do something. The question is what? Like, how do you get a creative input to help you prioritize and understand that risk so you make that sort of decision.
All right, so that's a perfect segue. So let's dive in. Right before we started this roundtable discussion, I talked about how one of the biggest, most interesting things to most of our audience members, how is, I guess, the landscape of attacks changing? So when we first held our first episode, we talked about the Colonial Pipeline hack. The next thing, this happened more recently, is we now see, I saw in this news, and while this hasn't occurred yet, this is, to me, an indicator of where things are going. But Anonymous, of course, recently put out a video. For those listening at the time of recording, it was today. They put out a video today or yesterday that said, they basically kind of threatened Elon Musk and Tesla and SpaceX potentially. It's not clear whether they're going to do something, but it does seem like foreign actors are attacking more often. And that is a big thing that is now happening. Of course, we're coming right off the heels of the SolarWinds attack. Different people are getting sued now for this. This doesn't seem to be changing. I'm going to start with Malcolm. You've seen this over your time and career and your history. Is it just being reported more, or are there like more and more organized, sophisticated efforts that are now attacking companies? And I'd love to hear your perspective on why this continues to increase.
Yeah, it's a little bit of both. So go back on my Intel days, 20 years ago, I drew a picture that I called the perfect storm of risk to explain how threats and vulnerabilities would affect information assets that were changing physically, logically, their usage model, exposing risk. My job was to put controls in place. And then I drew this hidden hand on this picture, starting with geopolitical, because nation states are both threat actors and threat agents adding to the cycle, but there are also legal and regulatory bodies that are driving additional levels of compliance and legal and regulatory risk. So you have this confluence of independent yet interdependent things that I theorized 20 plus years ago would create this perfect storm of risk. I think we're seeing it play itself out. The reality is if it can execute code, it can execute malicious code, right? Whether it be an app, a device. And because of that urban sprawl of technology, and frankly, the job we've done in the security development lifecycle to mitigate risk up front, and then the sloppy job we've done in the back end to operationalize security, we frankly are living in the mess that we've created for ourselves because of the poor economic incentives that have existed for the creators of technology and the operators of it to do something the right way and manage the risk better.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I think, the two kind of proof points of that being the root cause. One is that Anonymous threatened Elon Musk, and it's a viable threat. Like, why is that?
Yeah.
Because they're not a nation state. That could be anyone doing that. But the fact that they've been emboldened to do it in the first place, and the fact that it's probably having an impact, kind of is symptomatic of the fact that we're not very good at this stuff. Like there is enough attack surface out there. There is enough debt kicking around for that to be a viable thing for them to say, even to begin with, right? I think beyond that, one of the advisories that came out that was really interesting last year was from CISA and the NSA talking about nation state use of endstate in coordinated attacks, and like SolarWinds and different things like that are examples of how much more pervasive and kind of scattergun APT can be when they've got an objective. I think prior to those kind of announcements, it was always seen as this very targeted, very unique niche thing that you had to be a certain type of organization to have to worry about. What we're now learning is that no, like they're economically rational in the same way that we are. And if you don't have to, burn a $2 million ISO day to get the job done, like why not just download something from ExploitDB? Because that will probably still work, which is kind of the point. Like there's so much debt around out there that those kind of strategies for those folks are still effective. That says something about where we're up to, I think, from a risk posture standpoint.
What are your opinions on how modern day apps and companies are built too? Because it feels like we are increasing the vulnerabilities every single time because we rely on, think about like if I think of Mission, which is a small company, the amount of SaaS products we use is actually quite substantial. And we have absolutely pushed data through open APIs into each of these toolkits. And so effectively, military style, you're only as strong as your weakest link. Like we're probably, I don't know where it is. It's there for sure. But that's everybody. And we're just a small company. And our company is only 8 people. Like a giant company like a GE or something like that, where there's 10,000, 50,000, 100,000 employees. What is happening? I'm curious on your perspective, because it seems like there's more gateways being opened. I would assume that there are more keys to shut these gateways down, but it doesn't seem like that's the case. Like it just seems like there's increasing vulnerability inside of every business. I'd love to hear your perspectives on this. We'll start with Malcolm.
Well, again, you have this urban sprawl, right, that occurred.
Yeah.
And that's not only the data, the apps, the devices, the locations, but also the APIs and the connections and the data flows. That's certainly part of the problem. On the app development side, though, again, this is where I think a lot of people have done better, particularly with things like Bugcrowd and vulnerability management programs and that upfront side of things. But the world that we live in, most people are still focused on minimal viable product. Minimal viable product is going to get you maximum security exposure, right?
Well said.
Quotable, for sure.
And that's just, like I said, it's an economic incentive issue that causes people to be sloppy because they're not held accountable in the same way you would be in a physical product liability sense.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I think this is something that's I've done talks on for a while now, where security's done ourselves a disservice as an industry is to go into people who develop stuff and say, hey, you're an idiot. Like, you screwed up, right? And in the meantime, like, we haven't necessarily built a platform or built a business or maintained those things. Like, we haven't actually experienced from the offensive side the same economic imperatives and incentives the people that are deploying that code. So our position to say that is a little bit, I think, underinformed to begin with. But, that's kind of the reality of the situation. Like, builders don't think like breakers. They're not incentivized to do the same things. They're logically different. And that's just the fact. Like, I think we can reconcile those things. It's a lot of what we do with Bugcrowd. And honestly, I think a root cause of a lot of this stuff in the first place, the idea that people that deploy code don't necessarily believe in the boogeyman. So when they see a security control, that they can either suffer the inconvenience to implement or push the feature by the deadline. Like, they're going to choose the latter because that's their job. And that's, honestly, you see that not just in, I think, companies that are thinking through an MVP lens in the startup space. I think that affects the enterprise as well, because everyone has those same motivations and those same incentives in place.
Sure.
Yeah. Well, and to your point, I have this framework that I developed back years ago that I called my 9 box of controls. One of the dimensions of the 9 box of controls is control friction, because controls are a drag coefficient.
Yeah.
They slow down people, data, business processes, chew up unnecessary compute cycles. But the design issue that we've got in the industry is that the practitioners and their enterprises are not held accountable to reducing that drag coefficient.
Yeah.
Hence, it causes their users of business to go around the control. And in the security software and device ecosystem, they just sell a product that also creates too much friction on the developers and on the users and stuff like that. And again, when there's friction and people go around the control, that generates risk. And since the security industry profits from the insecurity of computing, the more risk that occurs, the more the security industry grows. So again, getting back to an economic incentive, I would submit that the security industry doesn't have an economic incentive by and large at a macro level to solve the problem.
Interesting.
Some are trying hard, but at a broad level, the industry itself doesn't give a shit about really solving the problem.
Yeah. I mean, this is an inconvenient truth, but it's a product of mass. So I think actually rebutting that as a vendor on this call is impossible, because what you've just laid out is literally the math of the situation. Like, the more, something that I throw out a lot with the team at Bugcrowd and with other people I speak to in the security solution space is the fact that this industry is a product of unintended consequence. Like, we're not actually really meant to be here. And I think it's helpful to remember that.
Yeah, it's a level of, like you said, it's a byproduct. It's a economic inefficiency. And unless we start dealing with it that way, we won't change the economic incentives across everybody who's touching it to do it the right way.
Yeah, and that's where I keep bringing it back to this idea of the fact that error is human. Like, the fact that there will be, like, why do we exist? It's because people make mistakes.
Yep.
And because there are, things that can be exploited as a product of those mistakes that, the adversary, like, the idea of someone leaving their front door open and another person taking advantage of that predates the internet by a couple of thousand years. So, like, this is not an internet thing. It's a human incentive thing. It's really like the nature of crime, the opportunity for crime, right?
Yeah.
So, okay, cool. Like, that's what we've brought into our space. How do we create that awareness in a tech context? Because as you're building a product, as you're getting your MVP out to market, all you're thinking about is making that thing work and then getting it adopted. The fact that you can kind of gloss over these kind of inconvenient truths from my perspective, that's the root cause of a lot of the problems that we actually see in the market. And it's not about being perfect. It's about being just that little bit better, but ubiquitously in a way that makes it economically irrational for an attacker.
If you're a developer or even a hardware architect, going back to my roots, you don't get demoted by creating a product that has a security flaw. You get promoted by having the functionality that can sell.
Yeah.
And getting a patent on that. And that's how you become a principal engineer. That's how you run engineering. There's no penalty for, as an engineering person, for the security flaws you might be creating in the product. Plus, risk is temporal. You might not find those security flaws till 6 months, a year, 2 years, 3 years down the road or longer.
So I used to think, oh, we should go to I read the book Fair Tax, and I was like, oh, we should go to a world of fair tax. It's pretty simple. And then someone told me, well, it'll never happen because the system is incentivized to make the tax code as complicated as possible so that you can constantly, if I'm a politician, say I'm going to help you vote a certain way. And if you're in accounting, you need the law to change, or software needs it to change. It's constantly updating, right? TurboTax can sell you a new version every year. Why? Because the laws changed. Like, you fundamentally can't use the version you just had, right? And so they described it that way. And then someone said it's also, you've probably heard described the same way in the pharmaceutical world, right? That they're not really that incentivized to solve chronic disease. They're more about like having you just exist with a chronic disease. And so in a way, security, application development, technology and advancement, the money rewards, as you suggested, Malcolm. If I can ship the best feature, if I can ship the best product, I win, right? I win more. And if I have security flaw in it, maybe, Casey can fix that for me.
I'll find it.
But again, it gets back to the friction thing that we were talking about. If you can do it in a way that creates adherence to the business process. Again, you think of I use this analogy of Formula One car, right? Everything is designed for velocity, right?
Yeah.
And even the spoiler on the back, it creates friction, but that friction creates a downforce to create cohesion to the track.
Yep.
And the driver, if you think of them as the developer or the end user, how are we designing controls that create velocity towards their mission, their business objective? And if we can do that and reduce those frictions and do it the right way, it becomes a heck of a lot easier.
Let's take a quick pause to remind you that today's episode is brought to you by the Salesforce platform, the #1 cloud platform for digital transformation of every experience. Now, let's get back to the conversation. So let's get started down that path. How should products be developed? I mean, I'm curious, like, what is something that's fundamentally that if you could redo it and say, hey, someone's going to give you, infinite money, or I don't know what you guys want, but infinite something, right? If you can just go back in time and fix this or these things, what were some things that you think fundamentally should change about product development because you were talking about, the incentive structure is upside down. Is it fixable? That's, I guess, the major question. Is it fixable? And if it is, what needs to change?
I'm not sure that infinite money is the place that you want to start there, because you end up with a bigger perverse incentive on the solution we came up with. But
all right, infinite money, throw that out. Whatever rewards incentive you want. If you got a chance to change how products are developed.
This is one of the things. So the listeners that don't understand how bug bounties work, really what the idea is that you go out to the open internet and say, okay, if you found something and you report it to us, we'll pay you for that.
Yep. And
the proportion of your payment is going to be corollary to the impact of what you found. I think the thing that's attracted me to this whole space in the first place is that, to me, that reflects the economic incentives of the adversary about as closely as you're going to get.
Yeah.
On the white hat side. It's not perfect, but it's getting pretty close, right? So those ideas of, being able to build out feedback loops around, how much does that cost? Like, if we put out $5 and we're getting hosed, what does that say about the cost to attack our business? Like, how do we create that feedback loop as an organization? But then also, I think on the receiving side, make that not this, kind of dirty laundry thing to be ashamed of, going back to the whole to err as human thing. It's not about hitting people over the head with a stick. It's about saying, hey, here's where you can improve. Like, this is the cost of not improving. Like, some kid from halfway across the world just owned your stuff, which means his next door neighbor, who might be a bad guy, could do the same thing. Like, this is real, right? And I think for engineers, that revelation, that moment of, this not being like this theoretical thing that they can just choose to ignore if they've got to push a product out by a date to hit a feature deadline, it's actually impactful to the user. that to me is a really powerful thing to begin with. The other thing that I would say is with respect to vulnerability disclosure. So the idea of, the way that I talk about this is almost like a lightning rod, right? Like, as a company that helps organizations do vulnerability disclosures, what we're not saying to them is that we can prevent lightning. Like lightning is just a thing. It's going to do what it wants, right? So what you can do in response to that is to acknowledge the fact that that's true and then try to get that kind of impact away from where it's going to create damage and route it down to where you can deal with it, which is kind of how a lightning rod works. I think those sorts of ideas, in terms of getting that information back into the business itself, it's a really valuable process to be able to actually identify what you need to fix next. But I think the broader thing is the idea that you needed to put that thing up in the first place. Like the fact that you've even done that is an acknowledgement of the fact that, we're going to have issues. That's not because we suck. It's not because we're not trying. It's not because we're terrible at security or that we're a bad company or anything like that. It's just a product of the fact that people are building our stuff. So let's acknowledge that and actually work with that. I think that kind of baseline, it's almost like, the 5 stages of grief thing that Katie Moe talks about sometimes, like the acceptance piece of that, where it's like, this is just a thing that we're going to have to deal with. Like if you can baseline around that, remove the stigma of when something goes wrong and just align around the fact that it's going to be a thing. So let's deal with it and let's learn from it. Let's try to reduce its existence in the future. Like that to me is a good starting point, I think.
Yeah, I would agree. And I think you said it well. And another way to rephrase it is you can't eliminate risk, just like we can't physically, logically, earthquakes, right? So you have a building code that you design to mitigate certain wind shear and earthquakes and fires and stuff like that. We don't have the equivalent of that professionalism in the broad IT space. The other thing, that I would say, there's a difference between incentives and motivations. And you can incent somebody, but it doesn't mean they're motivated, right? It's the difference between somebody who's compliant and somebody who cares, right? I'd rather have somebody who cares than somebody who's compliant. And I think we have to work on both sides of the incentives we were talking about on the economic side, but also the motivations. And we've got to start putting more human stories on it and looking at the fact that people's lives are at stake. And I posted something on this the other day on ransomware and pay or not pay, because it's a tough dilemma, right, to pay or not pay. But I said, in the organizations that I've run and what I've always had is a set of principles defined ahead of time. Would we pay or would we not pay? And under what circumstances? Who's the decision maker? Who has input? All that stuff, just like you would in a physical kidnapping and ransom, right? This is just a logical one. But you have to recognize if you're paying, you don't know who's on the other side of it. And you might be aiding in human trafficking. You might be funding a terrorist. You might be funding a drug lord. And for the reality of it, a lot of people think I overplay it. But, it wasn't that long ago. And I think it was the book Future Crimes that Mark Goodwin wrote, and former Interpol guy and stuff like that. There was some traceability for the Mumbai bombings in 2008 that indicated about $2 million for the funding of that physical terrorist event came from cybercrime.
Dang.
And so if we all looked at it and said, our sloppiness, even in managing InfoSec in a mom and pop mid-retail company, could lead to nickels and dimes that flows to an event like that, we would act differently. And we would demand more of the security industry to sell us better products.
Yeah, and in terms of the tolerance to those kind of controls being put in place, because I think that whole idea around, is a solution to ransomware to make payment illegal? That's obviously a fragile proposition, but I think it's getting at the right part of the value chain for the attacker. I do feel like a lot of the conversations around how to mitigate the threat side of this are starting to happen in the right direction, but it does leave open the question, why is that so easy in the first place? If, and assuming that we can, mitigate on that end of things on the threat side, what will they come up with next?
Yeah, and every press announcement on a breach, a sophisticated actor. Really? It wasn't that flippant sophisticated. I mean, you did a sloppy job, and we then try and cast it off to deflect liability rather than say, let's go do attribution to the control that failed. Instead, we try and do attribution to the threat actor and threat agent. That's a distraction from what I'm responsible for as a chief security officer, which is managing the vulnerability of my organization. And anything that is not focused on that is a distraction to what I can manage.
No, dude, so you guys are starting to get fired up, which I love, right? It was a good discussion. I want to dive into something that you guys both have said independently a couple different times, but you said about like fundamentally incentive structure is what needs to change. How do you envision the incentive structure changing? You kind of hinted at it just a moment ago, Casey, where it's like, hey, maybe it's a legal thing where actually the laws have to change to mitigate this type of behavior. Talk a little about how should companies get paid, not paid? Like, well, that's usually in incentives. When I think incentives, I usually think money, but it might not be money. Like, give me a flavor for what you're thinking of how, if we fundamentally as a people, as a human, as business operators thought differently, we could probably mitigate more risk. Like you said, not eliminate, but mitigate more, like reduce it some.
Yeah, no, definitely. And to your point around like mitigate, not eliminate, I think, legal changes are an aspect of it. They're not a silver bullet. Often they're treated like that by legislators.
Yes.
And it does come back to this fact that bad guys are innovative and they have to eat.
Yeah.
So even if that law works, you're going to have to deal with something that comes after the thing that you've solved. So I don't see that as a solution that exists in perpetuity. It's going to be, effectively an arms race for as long as, crime exists and the internet can facilitate that. My personal belief on this, sometime between now and the heat death of the universe, the consumer is actually going to care about whether or not they're going to get hacked buying a product, right? That hasn't happened yet. I feel like we're trending in that direction. There's enough narrative around that to start to, I feel like, at this point in time, an interesting thing about the Bugcrowd story is that we actually landed in the US the same month that Snowden did his disclosures around NSA, which it might be colored a little bit in hindsight by what has happened since with Bugcrowd, but I've been in security as a career since high school, which is a long time before we landed in the US, right? And, to me, like that was when people actually started to consider the possibility that they should actually care about this stuff. Like prior to that, it wasn't really a thing.
Mm-hmm.
And then like the next year, you've got 60% of the US population getting their credit card breached. So like now hacking happens to me.
Yep.
The year after that, it's OPM, it's Ashley Madison. Okay, so now it hurts. 2016, you've got the attacks on the election. So now like my country's getting hacked. And it's just gotten progressively more kind of dystopian since then. 2020, it's, my 5-year-old's responsible for my corporate attack surface. 2021, like ransomware's eating the world basically. And my 5-year-old's gone off and basically progressed their influence on my corporate attack surface. So like we're in this position now where that's not just a security conversation. That's something that the layperson is thinking about.
Yeah.
I think if we get to the point where, Pat Gray was talking with Tim Watts, who's a politician here in Australia, around this idea of retail politics. Like once you've got an issue at the point where the layperson is voting based on that, or their vote is at least partly influenced by that, at that point, the overall incentive around the reason for that problem existing in the first place starts to get shifted by the political agenda. I think that's going to be the thing that ultimately shifts this. I don't know how long that's going to take, to be honest. And like there's different things that I think can be done to influence it. Going back to what I was saying before around, some errors I feel that the security industry just at large has made. We've made it all about the stick. I think it should also be about the carrot. So how do we make it attractive to do this well? Like how do we, if someone's walking into a Best Buy and choosing between this router and that router, all things, considered otherwise being equal, if they know that one's more secure than the other, what gets them to the point where they choose that other thing? It's those sorts of things that I think create, like we need to make this about actual enablement of the business, not just being an insurance policy and trying to hold off, a bad day.
Malcolm,
Yeah.
I was thinking about that with the new Apple campaign. They're very much focused. And in this case, it's not security, but they call it privacy, right? It's about privacy, right? That's like the principal feature of their phone that they're touting more so than anything else. Because like kind of like what you said, a better camera, a better screen, all these things are becoming, I don't know, they're relatively comparable, very comparable. So then they're saying, I'm more private than the other.
Definitely. I think with that, my view is the layperson confuses security and privacy just in general when it comes to this space, right? Like it's interchangeable. That's not their dumb thing. It's just confusing.
Yeah.
So I can understand why that happens.
Right.
And as an intrinsic value to a consumer, privacy is more relevant more quickly than security. Like security is this abstract thing. What if nothing bad happens, right?
Yeah. It's like insurance.
Whereas with privacy, this this is my personal information. Like, I don't want that to go where I don't want it to go. That's a value add for me. I'm going to choose that thing.
Yeah, I was gonna say, it's interesting that you were talking about those differentiators for consumers, and I completely agree with you, Casey. A couple of years ago, I gave testimony at the U.S. Senate Commerce and Technology Committee on the promise and perils of emerging technology, and one of the senators shortly afterwards introduced a security bill to basically do the equivalent of Energy Star ratings for cybersecurity products, or the safety crash equivalent. Couldn't get it off the ground, and actually some of the big tech that was on that panel was against it. Why? Because it would mean more work for them, right? So we've got to do those type of incentives to make it easier for consumers. And then I think we also have to look at it, and I'm not big on regulation, but regulation done right will help with some of these things. So think of, again, 15, 16 years ago, Sarbanes-Oxley, we had a bunch of financial integrity and financial reporting issues in the US. And then all of a sudden, the CEO, the CFO, the general counsel, the executives had to attest to their internal controls on financial reporting and financial integrity. Not that they wouldn't have errors in their numbers occasionally, but they wouldn't be material or impactful, right, to the shareholders. We could do the same thing for cybersecurity and say, you have to attest to your processes in the design and development of technology you're selling, and to the technology that you're operating as a business. If we did that and held people accountable to that attestation with the level of personal liability, you'd create a lot of incentive differences to do it right. It doesn't necessarily mean spending more money. It just means spending it in the right places in the right way to affect change.
So the way that it was described, we talked about, not too long ago and earlier in the conversation, how the modern enterprise or modern business relies on so many different technology partners. That's just the reality of it. We rely tremendously on many, many interconnected technology partners. And if we were to increase the culpability, the responsibility, or however that works, like you mentioned, the rating systems, doesn't your entire chain have to be rated the same way? Otherwise, aren't you weakened by whoever is that, back to that original, like whoever's the weakest link in your stack? Isn't that the problem then?
Not necessarily. Being vulnerable and being exploitable are two different things. Right. And so it depends upon the context of the vulnerability in the context of the enterprise, along with other mitigating controls to whether or not that's exploitable and can create material or significant harm. Right. And if we did it the same way you do for financial side of it, material and significant harm, well, we would clear the clutter of all these ankle biter things, because just by dealing with better processes, we'd get rid of that stuff. And then we'd focus on the things that's going to really bite us and bite us hard. And if we did that, maybe we would have not had the Colonial Pipeline. Maybe we wouldn't have had a SolarWinds. Maybe we wouldn't have some of these bigger things that are starting to create a systemic societal risk.
Yeah, agreed. I mean, to me, there's that part that's talking about the stick and the regulatory side of things. I think the other piece of that is to be able to communicate that to the consumer. So it's not just you've violated regulation. Like, how do I explain to a layperson that I'm actually doing this well? And how is there, accountability around the ways that I'm doing that? So that it's not just I take security seriously. Like, there's, things that are practical and have some degree of consensus around them that makes them, understandable to someone that's making a choice between one product and the next. The more it can be simplified down at that point.
Cars are highly complex with a lot of integrated systems and parts.
Cars are a great example. Yeah.
And, airplanes, trains, there's so many different physical analogies of things that have a lot of complexity to them.
Yeah.
But we reasonably manage the risk pretty well. And injury happens and unfortunately people die. But by and large, considering the amount of that stuff occurring, we're not seeing catastrophic things day in and day out. We were in the 50s before Nader pushed seatbelts, right?
Yeah.
And stuff like that. So we've got to think, differently on how we do what I call being a choice architect. So again, I was in Australia actually a few years ago, and somebody had asked me how I'd define my role, and I'm like, I'm a choice architect. I'm architecting choices for the business. Just some of those choices I get to make. Some the CIO does, some the CTO does, some the CEO, some of the board. If I architect choices better, right, then we will end up with better decisions, which will result in lower risk.
All right, you got me convinced. Your Morningstar concept, I like it. I was thinking about that as you guys were talking about how, like you mentioned for aviation or vehicles, like we try to treat the vehicle, we hold Toyota responsible for its entire supply chain. like if something failed on my car, I'm like, well, who made that part? I don't think that way. I think, hey, Toyota, you built this car. You're responsible. If there's a mechanical failure, it's your responsibility to fix this.
Or give an example, look at the airbag issue, right?
Yeah.
A safety mechanism that had a problem and Takata got crucified before it. Well, guess what happens in the security industry? All of that has failed, and the stocks of the companies who sold product that didn't work goes up. In what world does that make sense that we celebrate the security industry's failure by increasing their valuations?
Yeah, that goes back, I think, Malcolm, to your point before around diverse incentive around cybersecurity actually solving this problem.
Yeah.
Like we want to do the things that we're asked to do, but the whole idea of being able to actually go in and solve it at a fundamental level, there's this sort of almost threshold that exists. We don't want to do it too well from a pure economic standpoint. And that ultimately goes back to integrity. I'm very aware of that concept as a vendor. I work to execute on the solution in spite of that. And there's others that do the same thing. But, the fact that exists as a perverse incentive, I don't think is something that should be ignored there.
All these things that you guys are saying, exactly, I'm thinking it's changed the framework of how I envision or how I think of other companies, because what you brought some great elements during this conversation that get me thinking about and relating it to other industries. And one thing I kept thinking about when you talk about mitigating risk is actually like this concept of how retailers budget for shrinkage. They just budget, meaning they actively invest in stopping it. But at no point do retailers assume it's never going to happen. They always assume it's going to happen.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, when I was in the retail credit industry before graduate school, I managed May Department, Southern California credit operations. We maximized net income with 2% bad debt, right? And we would play with the credit ratings daily. If revenue was running light and bad debt was running low, we would loosen credit. Why? Because we maximized net income with a 2% bad debt. People couldn't pay, and fraud made up that 2% bad debt.
You build it into your business model and plan ahead.
Right.
I think tying cybersecurity with automotive, because automotive's a great example of an industry that's safety critical and has clear regulations around it and clear kind of grading and scores and different things like that. But also I think a really clear impact of what happens when you get it wrong. Tesla had a vulnerability come in 5 years ago, that they were able to basically ingest, remediate, regression test, deploy into a test fleet and then deploy into their entire fleet over the air in 11 days from receiving that report.
Yeah, bananas.
That didn't happen by accident. Do you know what I mean? That's a whole lot of planning ahead that goes into that, which kind of goes back to, Malcolm, what you were just saying around assumed risk and how you build that into your business model. That's a cost for them. So they've had to plan that again. Maintaining all of that infrastructure to make that work is expensive. But what they've been able to do is to reduce, the cyber risk to the users, reduce the physical risk as a consequence of cyber risk, just in general. This didn't actually speak to that, but hypothetically, if it did, the problem would have been solved in the same way. And I think as a result, this is kind of going back to my whole thing around how do you make security sexy for the consumer, right? And you tell that story to someone who's had their vehicle recalled for a similar problem, they're going to start to think that Tesla's a more secure product. So in that example, you've got almost, I think, a pattern of how to increase usability as you do this stuff in a way that's relevant to the user, solve the actual problem, but then also make it attractive enough for people to want your stuff more.
Well, I think your point earlier, or both of your points about the consumer demand side, that's going to start happening because I have noticed myself, I don't like updating products, right? I think it's annoying. And there was a wave of products, and you absolutely know this, that for some reason, they couldn't update your firmware over the air. You had to get your USB to download the newest packet off your computer.
It's before they built that and put it in. Yeah.
Yeah. So, but it has gotten to the point where, as like you mentioned before with Tesla, I've seen it. Well, we obviously experience it with our phones now. It's this idea that you need to be a business constantly innovating and delivering updates. I think that is absolutely a brand desire. Now, it hasn't quite, I don't think, transformed into hey, this is more secure. Like you kind of mentioned before, security and privacy. People kind of confuse the two things. But I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if not in the not so distant future, it becomes a major critical factor in decision making for purchasing products, where it's hey, how secure is this product?
Yeah.
Some brands, I think some of the the more adventurous folks who take a first mover position on it will do well because they'll be able to establish themselves as the security brand that cares about the consumer, cares about the consequences and impact to them. And then, and again, like you mentioned, the confusion between security and privacy. I've always said that security and privacy are like two magnets. Turn one way, they're perfectly binding because you need good security to have privacy. But security can also encroach upon privacy if it's not done right. And privacy can stay sometimes too academic, too legal,
subjective,
and not be practical enough. So when you do that, it's like having the magnets turned and then they polarize each other. What we've got to do is to design an architectural issue to bind them. And if you start with that as a goal that you're trying to achieve security and privacy, we will actually lower the risk on both sides of it.
Yep.
There you go, gentlemen. I appreciate you guys joining us today on our security series. Thanks for sharing some of the insight and some of the vision you have for what's happening in the current marketplace, as well as what you think needs to happen outside the present day environment to further enhance mitigation in security. And I get, we talked all about a lot of topics, but I got to close with one thing. We keep hearing about artificial intelligence. And one of the things that has been postulated a lot, and I'd love to hear your perspective on this, is AI ever going to be so smart where it can stop any attack, where I don't need, no offense to Casey here, but where I don't need your team. Like I literally have an AI in my network system constantly looking for bugs and able to detect and fix, irregularities. I don't know. How far away is that, or is that never going to happen? Because the bad actors, as you said, in the history of time, as we also talked about in this conversation, there's always been a bad guy. There's never been, never have humans lived in peace. Like, oh, everyone's kumbaya. We all love each other. There's always been a bad guy, and there's always going to be, we can assume, smart bad guys. Is AI ever going to be able to actually protect us from any bad actor, or is it always just going to be, the race just continues? We're always going to have someone trying to trump it.
Yeah, the way that I talk about it, it's like the Iron Man suit.
Yeah.
Like the human without the suit is weak. The suit without the human is dumb. If you view, and this is like excluding Jarvis existing yet, which is kind of your question. So if you go back to that kind of construct, the idea that, AI and machine learning, these different kind of, computer learning things that we've got to work with now in cybersecurity and right across the board, they're levers. They're not a replacement in my mind for human intelligence. Mm-hmm. To your question around like, will the singularity, which is, kind of how people talk about it, replace human creativity when it comes to defense? Like that's the answer that I give to that is that, if and when that happens, we're going to be worried about Skynet, not these conversations. And I'm going to be thinking about how to hack that stuff to make sure that humans stay safe. So like that's, to me, kind of this abstract, I do think it's possible just from like a theoretical computer science standpoint. Like you look at quantum and different things that could enable that and actually change the game in terms of how that stuff works. I don't think it's outside the realm of possibility. I don't think we're anywhere close to it at this point in time. And that would be my answer.
There you go.
Mine would be anything that executes code can execute malicious code. AI is made up of machines that has code, that has systems. So AI itself will also be manipulated and compromised. And you can manipulate it. I mean, it wasn't that long ago that I think Microsoft had a bot that people were playing with by doing things that then turned around and put profanities and other things out there.
Start swearing at all the Xbox players or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. So I think, for me, I'm a former finance guy, right? An IT finance guy, an IT procurement guy.
Yeah.
Automation's job is to increase our effectiveness and efficiency.
Yep.
AI is the same thing. It's the same thing as that exoskeleton suit. If it's increasing your effectiveness and efficiency, do it. If it's not, don't buy the marketing bullshit.
And that would be the the golden takeaway, I think, from that. Like it still gets misrendered today. Like there was I think a spike in that as AI kind of first got on the scene and people started talking about it, where it was kind of oversold in that sense.
Yeah.
People expected it to just take care of everything for them. And then that over time was proven not to be what it actually did. So that's good. But it's still, I think, perceived, a lot of the time in that sort of way. Like this is a replacement for humans. Artificial intelligence is sort of in the name, right? And, to be able to double click on that a little bit and say, what are we actually talking about here? What does it actually do? What is it useful for? And making sure that everyone's clear on that side of things, I think is really important. Going back to what you were saying, Martin, Malcolm, around the the vulnerabilities in ML and AI itself, we're starting to really dig into educating people on how to do adversarial ML testing. So like this idea, there was a really funny POC that happened in the Bay Area, 7 or 8 years ago at this point, where people tricked GPS on a certain traffic system to reroute traffic on the peninsula, and it worked. There's a more recent example where literally someone got a whole bunch of phones, put them in a little trolley, walked it really slowly across the bridge, and simulated a traffic jam in the same way, and was successful in that, diverted traffic. And that was an attack. Like, it's low tech, right? But in terms of the concept that it's proving, that's where some of the weaknesses exist in these types of things.
Yeah, it got many machines to behave a different way.
Yeah, it's untrusted input.
Yeah.
No, well, and you're exactly right. I used as an analogy several years ago in a speech, because cement providers are starting to put sensors in cement, right, to aid in maintenance and traffic routing and all that stuff. And I talked to the CTO of a cement company. I'm like, how are you dealing with the security of this? And he's like, what do you mean? I'm like, what do you mean? What do I mean? It's like, and I'm like, look, if I can play with the flow of that data, and this was after the Boston bombings. I was like, imagine I want to redirect traffic towards a kinetic event.
Yeah.
I could do that and utilize flaws in the logic or the technology and move traffic towards something rather than what it's intended for if I knew how to manipulate it.
It's like the principal technology every spy movie uses, right? To like reroute the red lights and green lights to getaway routes.
It's the fire stuff. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like, I look at ML from like my viewpoint. What we've seen with Bugcrowd is that we call it the moment, like the degree to which that exists in a particular category of technology tends to be fairly proportional to how that category is adopted in market, right? And when you think about ML, we've just gone and slammed it across everything we can think of.
Yeah. And
there's starting to be evidence of that, not having been necessarily a thoughtful process. Like the flash crash of 2008, I think it was, where, high-speed traders, which are ultimately, like, this is early ML before, Silicon Valley got a hold of it and started to market it, right? Like, it's a similar sort of concept. And that got gamed and exploited and tanked the NASDAQ. This can go wrong because people just haven't thought through the unintended consequence. That's always going to exist. Like, anytime people design stuff, that possibility is always there. I think this is no exception to that.
Casey, Malcolm, I appreciate you guys joining us today on our security series. Thanks for sharing your insight, your career, and your perspectives on what's happening in the climates of cybersecurity today. I hope you had a good time on the show. Any last words you have for our audience members?
I always say a fool with the tool is still a fool.
That's a pretty good landing spot. Honestly, my kind of inverse of that is that, human creativity is intractable to cybersecurity. I'm biased in saying that, given what I do for work, but part of the reason I do what I do for work is because I believe that. That's why I founded the company.
I agree with both of you. Listen, I don't believe that AI machines can ever solve all the problems. I believe we always need a human trying to solve a puzzle or whatever problem is being presented with us. I look at it from the perspective of me just trying to change a flight through those automation systems. It's like virtually impossible for anyone who's ever done it. Like, what is your locator number? GDP4. And it's like, I don't understand. It's like, damn it. Like, we're so far away. We're so far away from something being predictive, analytical. You know what I mean? Like, I think I agree with you guys. These technologies have come a long way, but there's still a long ways to go. And I just don't see a space where the computer solves everything. I don't see it, because people will always find a way, I think, around it.
So in the meantime, people finding a way is part of the solution.
That's it.
That's where I was getting to with that. Like the whole idea of, subjectivity, context, application of risk, prioritization, getting ahead of what the attackers are going to do and where they're going to be most effective. That's going to be a part of our day job, I think, for a long time to come. Exactly.
Plus the incentives and value systems for people to find ways to close these loops. That's exactly it. Gents, I appreciate you joining me today on IT Visionaries. Thanks for being part of the security series.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks.
IT Visionaries is created by the team at mission.org and brought to you by the Salesforce platform, the #1 cloud platform for digital transformation of every experience. Build connected experiences, empower every employee, and deliver continuous innovation with the customer at the center of everything you do. Learn more at salesforce.com/platform.